probably a little bit terrified when you saw I was responsible for the sermon this morning. But fear not, I'm channeling my inner Ian and sharing with you her writings from her book about the Bible, about the Apocrypha. I used that word 10 times yesterday. Your study Bible probably had a map that shows that while the landmass of Israel was, and still is, small, its location on the east side of the Mediterranean has always been strategic. Given the surrounding deserts, anybody who wants to trade with the nations to the west needed the sea, and therefore to the land Israel claimed for its own. So here come the invaders. In 722 BCE, Assyria moved in and took the north part of the country. Then in 586, Jerusalem was sacked by the Babylonian Empire. The temple was destroyed, and the people were taken into captivity. A good chunk of the Bible was written during this Babylonian captivity, or exile, as people reflected on what happened to them and tried to make sense of it all. 50 years later, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, both of whom have books in the Bible named after them, the Israelites were allowed to return and to rebuild. The scrolls that became the Hebrew Bible were finished and solidified by Ezra during this time. But Israel's location and strategic importance had not changed. As the power of Babylon faded, the power of Greece rose, and the power of Greek culture made itself felt far and wide. Alexander wasn't called the Great for nothing, and his conquests around 330 BCE ensured that both Greek culture and Greek language flourished wherever he went. Greek language and culture had a mixed perception with the Jewish population. It was a source of conflict between the Hellenizers, those adopting the Greek ways, and the more traditional Jews in both the Old and the New Testaments. Now, the religious leaders had a problem. People were less and less able to understand their own sacred texts, which were written primarily in Hebrew. This was especially true for Jews living outside of Israel, where the Greek language reigned supreme. To address this need, some 70 or so scholars began to work on a translation of the Hebrew Bible in Alexandria, Egypt, sometime during the 3rd century BCE, and they produced the Septuagint. The popularity and the scope of the Septuagint grew, however, and it included some books that were non-traditional, so that by 132 BCE it included some additional writings that were not in the collection brought together by Ezra. These extra books were newer Jewish writings from the Second Temple period, about 530 to 70. There will be a test at the end. All the dates. A 30-page paper, which I'm looking forward to. These interest to the Jews, but were not accepted as part of the canon of the Hebrew Bible. Because they were not in the Hebrew Bible, but only in the Septuagint, they became known as the hidden books. And in Greek, that translates to the Apocrypha. What to do with them? Christians had been using them as sacred texts from the beginning due to their inclusion in the Septuagint. Many early Christian communities disputed with the Jewish conclusion that these books were not to be considered part of the canon and continued to see and use the Apocrypha as part of Scripture. And why wouldn't they? They themselves were circulating new texts. They had letters from Peter and Paul, all sorts of stories about the life of Jesus, and their own early history that provided nourishment for their souls and guidance for their lives and their new truths. But there was a solution brewing. By about 70 CE, there was a new world superpower. You may have heard of it. It's called Rome. And its official language was Latin. Eventually, a Latin Bible translation was needed. In the 4th and 5th century CE, a Christian priest named Jerome provided it. His translation was known as the Vulgate, from the Latin word for language of the people, and included New Testament texts as well. Jerome was later canonized for these efforts. Jerome did his Old Testament translation from the Hebrew Bible and not the Septuagint, so he had a decision to make. What to do with these extra books known as the Apocrypha? Well, Jerome was wise and took a middle ground. He did not believe they should be considered part of the Bible per se, but he did believe they were valuable. Other Christian leaders at the time thought they should be part of the Bible without reservation. So he compromised. He included them in the Vulgate, but he separated them out into their own section. And so the Apocrypha sat in the Bibles of the church for the next 1,000 years, accepted by many as divinely inspired and questioned by others. And then comes along those pesky Protestants. When the Protestant reformers came along in the 16th century, however, the debate over these books was reignited. Believing the Hebrew Bible to be closer to the original than the Septuagint, the Protestants joined the Jews in refusing the authority of these contested books. Martin Luther kept them completely out of his German translation, and eventually most Protestant translations took the Apocrypha out as well. Catholic and Orthodox churches, however, kept them in with a few small differences between the two traditions. And that is still the general rule. Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches refer to these books as deuterocanonical. There will be a test on all the language used in this as well, which means second canon. The original 1611 version of the King James included the Apocrypha, although it's difficult to find a later version of the King James that has it. In the late 20th century, there came to be more interest in the Apocrypha, even in Protestant circles. After all, the Septuagint was in broad use among Jews in the first century. So both Jesus and Paul would have known these stories and perhaps considered them sacred. Now you can find some Protestant translations of the Apocrypha that include the Apocrypha, as Jerome included it in a separate section. The Apocrypha includes some great stories, and you're going to hear a couple of them from Laura in just a minute. And there are some additions in the books of Daniel and Esther, letters, prayers, and large swaths of history that give the reader a sense of what was happening in Israel during the 200 years just prior to Jesus' birth. They're definitely worth reading. Did God inspire them? You'll have to decide that for yourself.